Welcome everyone. Good afternoon. If I did not hear a response. Assalamu alaikum everyone. There you go. That's much better. If we can ask everyone to please go ahead and take a seat. We will be starting our next session, and we do have some very prolific and smart panelists who will shed light on a topic that is very pertinent to us as a country and as a community as well. So please go ahead and take a seat. My name is Autocratic, and I'm the Vice President of Policy and Programming at the Muslim Public Affairs Council, MPAC. And thank you again for joining us today. And this is actually, I'm going to be a little biased, this is my favorite panel, because the topic is something that many of us, those of us who are students of the Middle East, those of us who are students of the MENA region, who've studied it for many years, have been personally invested in the region. This topic is one that has consumed us for many years, but especially this past year. This past year has been a year of major change and shifts in Syria. Late last year, we saw major shifts in the fall of the Assad regime. After a decade of war, of authoritarianism, of torture, of just every kind of human rights abuse that you can imagine, we saw the Syrian people finally able to breathe a sigh of relief and with the fall of the Assad regime, actually be able to establish a nation, a governance system that would be representative of the diversity, the cultural history, the richness of Syria. And as many people say, Syria is a bellwether for the region. Syria really points to where the region can potentially head and where it can go. But these past few months have also been extremely dizzying, because there's so much going on in Syria, and not just in Syria, but in the region. And the response of Syria's neighbors, of course, there's the Gulf, there is Israel, there is Egypt, there is so much that is, and then the rest of the states that surround Syria, but so much has happened just in the past few months. So we have a really amazing panel of speakers who will be able to shed light on what has happened in the past few months, and they've been intimately involved, and we'll go into that a little bit, but what's happened in the past few months, but also what this means not only for democracy in the region, for self-governance in the region, for authoritarianism in the region, but also what this means for us as Americans. And I think that's key. We as Americans, I think the reason we gather here and the reason we have these conversations is because we as Americans know that democracy and rule of law is extremely important. It is what's given our communities here, American Muslim communities, Arab American communities, South Asian American communities, it is what's given us the ability to thrive in this country. Rule of law and democracy has given us, again, as minorities, the ability to thrive in this country. And so what happens in that region and the relationship between our government, our communities, and what happens in the region, and specifically Syria, is extremely important and of utmost importance. So I'll quickly introduce, I don't want to go into detail, but quickly introduce our panel. We will give them some opening remarks, and then we'll go into a conversation and a discussion with questions and answers. Our first panelist is Wael Zayat, who is the CEO of Engage USA. Prior to leading Engage. Wael was at the State Department for many years and worked on Syria, and so he brings a level of experience and understanding that'll be really helpful for us to understand. Our second panelist is Mohammed Ghanem, who is policy chief at the Syrian American Council. Mohammed has been back and forth between the U.S. and Syria, and just watching his social media activity has been enlightening. He's been meeting policymakers here. He's been meeting policymakers in Syria, and it's been just great to see the Syrian American community really be able to mobilize and effectively engage both here and in Syria. And then our last panelist is Qutayba Idlibi, who's senior fellow and head of Syria Initiative at the Rafiq Hariri Center and Middle East Programs. And just recently, we found out that he will be joining the Syrian Foreign Ministry, and we're really happy that to have him and have him shed light on what he will potentially be doing and what he has been doing. So we'll go ahead and get started with Wael.
My fellow Syrian colleagues here, and to be with all of you, and thank you to CSID for consistently doing this important conference year in, year out. It's a very important topic and subject when it comes to the region. I'll be brief. That's probably my State Department training. So if I go over, 10 minutes, let me know. Obviously, you've all been watching the historical developments in Syria, which to some degree caught many of us by surprise in terms of the pace, in terms of the change of how it happened and how it's continuing to happen. Of course, we all had hoped that this day would come, but did we imagine that it would come on December 8th the way it did, and Syria today would be where it is and where it seems to be heading? I think the answer is no. There were signs of it. The regime has been crumbling from within. Its backers have been weakened over time, whether in Ukraine or in Lebanon or in Iran. Its source of funding, its morale, and obviously its corruption and abuse of its people contributed to that. But what I'm really looking at is where does Syria go and how does that impact the region and the global community, including the United States. I think that you have an administration here that is pushing forward in historic ways and in bold ways, but for different reasons, right? There's no monolithic reason within this administration, just like in any administration, but it is a confluence of interests that are coming together. The geopolitical imperative, obviously the reorientation of Syria is of interest to a lot of folks, including senior members of the Trump administration, particularly, Secretary of State Rubio and others like him. Others look at the opportunity to cement relations with Saudi Arabia, with Turkey, and to forge kind of a new axis in the region that is focused on investment and development and growth and stability through that. And here are the personal relationships, obviously, that have been developed over time between President Trump and the Saudi Crown Prince, the President of Turkey, and others in the region, has clearly played a role. Personalized or patrimonial politics is a way to understand what's happened here. It's personal relations, and but also reading what the new U.S. envoy to Syria and ambassador to Turkey has been posting, you would think it's a far-left liberal on the West Coast talking about the imperialist past of the region and the need to give it more agency and independence, but that's coming from Tom Barrack, who works for President Trump.
How is that?
And so how is that? I think that what we have to understand is the Trump administration is a unique administration. We often think in Democratic or Republican terms. But they're not quite just that. They are obviously a Republican administration, but they have their own view on the region and the world, and they have their relationships. And I think that they have, and this is something that Trump has always said, which is, look, we don't want to be involved in wars in the region. We want to be making money. We want to be investing, and I want to have friends. I don't want to have enemies. Now, where he will run into trouble, as you're seeing with Ukraine and maybe the Iranian negotiation or even Gaza, is he loves to make a deal, right? And thankfully, the new Syrian leadership is looking to make deals, right? President al-Shara in Syria and his team, they want to make deals because they want to rebuild the country. So the interests are aligning in that sense. They're aligning with the Europeans, who also not only want to make a deal, they want to send back some refugees, hopefully, or at least tell their politics, their political, their community that, look, they can go back now, even if not most of them go back. But where I think the administration will run into issues is when there are intractable issues, when their interests do not align, right? The interests of Russia and Ukraine do not align. The interests of Israel and the Palestinians do not align. And the interest of Syria in some level with the US, with the Europeans, with the Israelis is not going to align in some areas, right? So it'll be interesting to see how do they navigate that, where it's less clear where the interests are. But I think just in a simpler way, looking at Syria and the map, where it's located, what's interesting about Syria is, people won't forget it when it is, a source of tension, of instability, but it's now extremely irrelevant, given the change that has happened there. Given the opportunity, and that's something I want to conclude with. From a U.S. perspective, when you look at Saudi Arabia and Turkey, who's in the middle? It's Syria. If you're looking at the energy gateway to Europe, if you're looking at a new hub for investments, and we can talk more about that, traditionally it's been what? Tel Aviv and Dubai. And I think a lot of people want to be in Syria. It's a lovely country. It's on the Mediterranean. It has gas, oil. It's bordering all these countries. It's 25 million people that can get to 30 million very quickly. There's a lot of tech and investments in tech that are possibly advantageous not just for Syria but for the investors. The country can benefit quite a bit from AI, for example, as it looks to redevelop its industries, to leapfrog a few steps. I think it can become a very big destination for tourists and tourism. And that's going to give some of those countries I mentioned a run for their money over time. And I think so what you're seeing, particularly from the Israelis, is a concern not about Syria as a source of instability. It's actually the opposite. What they're concerned about is a stable and prosperous Syria, which will compete with them in many ways and across many fields. Where does democracy, inclusivity, transparency comes into play here? A lot of questions, I think, going to remain about Syria and where it's heading. Elections have been announced to be in about 4 years or so. People are asking whether that's too long. Is that just right? It certainly needs time, obviously. But others are asking, okay, inclusivity, and let's not, talk about minorities and all that. It's just inclusivity of different political perspectives, different even views on the economy, for example, or about the political orientation of Syria. Are you going to see political parties in Syria? Are you going to see opposition groups tolerated? What's the extent of the freedom of speech? It's not just about the superficial Western view of looking like, are people going to drink or not and wear miniskirts? Like, the personal liberties issue, actually, I think the government is too sophisticated for that. They're beyond that stuff. It's like, you can have your personal liberties, but the real litmus test is going to be the management of the country and its future, and how inclusive is that going to be? Not about necessarily like this particular group or that particular, but anybody with different or diverse views or not part of the inner circles of the new leadership. That's going to be a challenge for the question of democratic governance. But so far, so good. And, these are exciting times and important times. And Syria will be probably one of the more dynamic countries to watch over the next decade.
Everyone, and good morning. Or should I say? Yeah, it's still morning. Good morning. It's really good to be here. Thank you to the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy for your consistent work on this very important theme. It is also a very relevant theme to Syria, and I hope that we can get into some of that today. Haris, I'm also biased. You are 100% my favorite moderator as well. When the organizers reached out to me, they asked me to offer an honest assessment of the situation on the ground, given that I've spent considerable time on the ground the past 6 months, but also to talk about where things are headed. I think Wael has done a very good job, my colleague Wael has done a very good job of speaking to maybe the geopolitics of Syria, how interests align or diverge. Maybe I should help you zoom in a little bit on this moment and what it means for Syrians. So a couple of points. Number one, I think we need to take a step back and just appreciate how meaningful this moment is for Syrians. And I'm going to talk from my own personal experience. I was born under Hafez al-Assad, and I spent most of my early adulthood under Bashar al-Assad. The Assads were all we knew. I had to, when I was a second grader, I skipped first grade. When I was a second grader, I was automatically added to a Tala'i al-Ba'ath, which is it's like literally translated as the vanguard of the Ba'ath Party. I was in the second grade. I didn't even know what that was. I remember seeing this huge portrait of Hafez al-Assad and being told that I was now Tala'i, like a member of this vanguard. Same when I was in middle school, Shabib al-Thawra, the youth of the Ba'ath Party. In college, of course, you also have to. So this was not just a political system that was based on authoritarianism. This was also a cult of personality, and it was all we knew. Now imagine all of that crumbling, this whole edifice crumbling. Imagine hearing the news saying Bashar al-Assad has fled Damascus. This was an Allahu Akbar moment for all Syrians. And for those who are not too intimately familiar with that, this was a hallelujah moment for Syrians. This was huge. This was epic. It was incredible. And so Syrians celebrated for months, and I think we're still celebrating. Now, I was in Doha when that happened. I was attending the Doha Forum because there was a lot of international diplomacy surrounding Syria at the moment, and the United States and the UK and Europe and other countries and Turkey and Russia convening to make decisions about what to do about the fact that those guys, like the current government now, at the time they were an army, they were on the verge of capturing Damascus. Should we allow that to happen? Should we not allow that to happen? What should be done about this? So of course we were there because we're advocates for Syria and we wanted to influence that conversation. Now that happens, I immediately lost interest in all these governments. I got on a plane, I flew to Beirut, and a car was waiting for me, drove over to Damascus. I'm from Damascus, born and raised. I had not been in Damascus for almost 15 years. I had been back in non-regime controlled areas a lot, in Aleppo, in Idlib, in the north generally, a lot, because we used to shuttle back and forth and work with folks on the ground, support civil society, local administrative councils and so forth. But I had not been back in Damascus for 15 years. Now, back to the moment of euphoria, people were euphoric, they were incredibly happy, even though, like, some of the people I ran into were in rags, literally in rags. The level of poverty, the level of immiseration, really language fails to capture how terrible the situation was. The cars from the 70s, the cabs, the taxis, incredibly small, very poor condition, clunkers basically. Nonetheless, people were happy. I was not surprised that they were happy because I understood and appreciated what that moment meant for Syrians. But The Economist, the magazine, was a couple of months ago they published a report saying, quote, Syrians are surprisingly upbeat. And for the economists, this didn't make any sense because the economy is in shambles. I wouldn't say it was on the brink of collapse, completely collapsed a long time ago. People had not been paid, civil servants had not been paid salaries for months. Economically speaking, if that's all you're thinking about, it was beyond abysmal. But to us, Syrians, this was not surprising because this was an incredibly meaningful moment. Now, mixed with that euphoria and that happiness and that joy, of course, I also encountered a lot of anxiety. Because of the same reason, the situation was abysmal. No electricity. The electricity was, we had it an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening. Transportation also very poor condition, and that has ramifications for your daily life. Going through daily life in Damascus, at least at the time, things have improved since then, but at the time was really, really hard. The things that you take for granted here, like taking a shower, I was not able to take a shower every single day, and I'm someone who likes to shower a lot. I was not, because it was incredibly cold. So Syrians have something called sobia, which is like a heating like stove. So you have that in your living room, but once you leave the living room, because there's no electricity, there's no central heating, it's like going to Siberia. If you want to go to the kitchen, it's like going to Siberia. If you want to go to the bathroom, it's going to Siberia. If you want to, you're going to have to heat up water. Okay, you're going to have to heat up water in order to take a shower. So the daily life incredibly tough. And so there was also a lot of anxiety about that, about the future, about the state of the economy. So that was my second point. So first point was the joy. The second point was the anxiety. Now, what about the legacy the regime left? If we said that Syria at the moment is rising from the ashes, this would not be a figure of speech. Syria is literally rising from the ashes. And I say ashes because the country, or at least large swath of the country, was literally burnt to the ground through barrel bombs and chemical weapons and the like. The country, entire cities were razed to the ground. That's why millions of people fled the country. So the legacy of the regime is one of utter annihilation, utter destruction. You go to some neighborhoods just outside, I wouldn't say just outside Damascus, they're actually part of Damascus proper, like Jobar. It's a moonscape, like nothing standing. You go to Daraya, you see also utter devastation. And I'm talking about parts of Damascus, let alone other parts of the country. If you take a trip from the north, from Idlib, all the way down to the south to Damascus, the most consistent thing you will see on your way down south will be destruction and destroyed buildings. Now, that destruction, of course, extends to state institutions themselves. Also, complete collapse of the state. This is what the new government inherited from the regime. I went to, just to give you an example, I was given a tour of Nufus. Nufus is the civil registry. That's where we record, births and marriages and divorces and the like. Very essential, basic service that Syrians need on a daily basis. Destroyed, computers broken, the machines to print IDs also broken or missing or stolen. To this day, it's been almost 6 months, to this day, the civil registry in Syria, especially in Damascus, I think throughout the country except for Idlib, still, if you have if you have a new baby, if you get married, if you get a divorce, you can't record any of that. So my attorney shared with me about a lady who recently had a divorce, but as far as the state is concerned, she's still married, so she can't move on with her life, and she's losing her mind. That's what he told me. She's losing her mind. If you get married and you have a spouse in Syria at the moment, and you need to do family reunion here, and you just can't, because the USCIS is going to ask you for a certain kind of document that the civil registry should issue. And this is just a small example of the utter devastation that the regime had wrought on the country. Now, this is literally what the government took over. Now, since then, I think the government has taken a lot of meaningful steps in order to improve a lot of these conditions. Today, for example, they signed, I think, what might be one of the biggest deals in Syria's history ever, a deal for the provision of electricity, I think worth almost $7 billion with a consortium of companies, including an American company. So policy-wise, the state seems to be headed in the right direction. The state is very focused on the economy, and I saw that focus, singular focus on the economy during the early days. I was in Old Damascus, and I discovered, this was barely a couple of days into the liberation of Syria, and I discovered that I was in Old Damascus, and I ran into Maqib Saga, like the chief of the Guild of Jewelers, and I was asked, what is this guy doing here? And they told me he just had a meeting with the government. I was amazed. Within a couple of days, they were doing these meetings because they were interested in stabilizing, the prices of gold and silver and stuff like that. This was within a couple of days. I think if I had been in their shoes, I don't think I would have done that within a couple of days. I think I would have had other priorities. But I'm wrong and they're right, because, and this is very good news for the population. Especially when my first month in Damascus, really people couldn't care less who was in government. And they cared, at least most people I spoke with, I'm not talking about elite civil society activists and the like. Most people I spoke with, and I spoke to a lot of everyday citizens, couldn't care less who was in the presidential palace. And they cared the most about putting food on the table, because this was an issue, it was a struggle. They cared about not going to bed on an empty stomach and not shivering in the winter. Those were the priorities. Now, if you combine that with the current government's focus on the economy, the current government is very interested in proving its mettle. The current government is very interested in delivering, improving themselves. So in that aspect, this is very good news for the population. Now, just two final points. On top of all this destruction that I've shared about, Syria, and as Syria was trying to rise from the ashes, it's not like, they had access to an expressway, or things were easy and all you had to do was just make the good policy decisions. Making good policy decisions was 100% a part of it, but that was not enough. Why? Because of crippling economic sanctions, especially U.S. sanctions. Now, we're talking about sanctions that date all the way back to 1979. A whole labyrinth of sanctions, from designating the SSD designation Syria as a state sponsor of terrorism, to the designation on the current government, to the Caesar Act, to the SALSA Act, the Syria Accountability Act, to so much more. I could go on and on about sanctions. So Syria was practically off limits. So here, as a community, the Syrian American community, over the past 14 years, because of our advocacy against the Assad regime, we had built this muscle. Now, we're not APAC, but we have built this muscle, and we put this muscle immediately to work, reaching out to senior lawmakers. We're talking very senior people in the Senate and the House. Of course, very consistent outreach to the administration that goes back to November of last year, to try and explain what's happening and also influence U.S. policy decision making. So I would say between the work that the community did, community and allies, of course, did in Washington, D.C., and the help that we got from MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia, and of course the president of Turkey, who spoke with Trump and asked him for help. President Trump asked President Erdogan for help with Ukraine, and in return, President Erdogan asked him for help with Syria, specifically with sanctions, and Trump said, "I don't mind." And so now that most of these sanctions have either been lifted or suspended, Syria, to quote the current U.S. envoy to Syria, Tom Barrack, Syria, quote, is open for business. So today, as I address members of the Muslim American community, I'm going to use the same phrase: Syria is open for business. And one of the recommendations that we have for you is to go and invest. Go and invest, go visit, go talk to people. I think it would be remiss not to say that some parts within the Syrian American community feel that they have been let down by some parts within the Muslim American community, because Syria, was a controversial issue and lots of stakeholders, but we also had a lot of allies. So that's something we're going to be forever indebted to. But now that Syrians are happy and overjoyed and Syria is open for business, one of the things that we would love the Syrian American to do is, to join in the moment. We have the same concerns that I get a lot of concerns from members of the Muslim American community who reach out to me and say, these things are happening, maybe some of the sanctions are being lifted, but there's a price you guys are going to have to pay. And of course we're aware of that. And this is something that we're also trying to navigate, but what we need is help. If you feel that we're going to be blackmailed, if you feel that we're going to be subject to this bargaining process, then what we need is your support. And so the final point I'll make is about the current government. So I've already shared with you the current government, the priority is to prove itself, prove its mettle, focus on the economy. Keep in mind, last year, just a few months ago, we had a lot of armed groups in Syria. The current president has done a miraculous job so far of uniting. It's the term that's bandied about in Syria is Tawhid al-Bunduqiyya. He's done an amazing job so far so good, of bringing a lot of these disparate groups under the umbrella of the Ministry of Defense. Now, there's still a lot of work to be done. Things could still happen, down the road. But one thing we were deeply concerned about, as even in January, was a Libya-like scenario where you have, or Sudan. I think the president, who's a force of nature, has done a very good job so far of trying to conclude a lot of deals. The last big deal that all Syrians are anxiously anticipating is the deal with the SDF, and the SDF is the U.S. partner force in the northeastern Syria. That's majority Kurds. I think this is going to, if some sort of an agreement has been concluded, but the devil is in the details, and it's all about implementation. Now, if that happens, and the government is also able to persuade the Druze in the south, in southern Syria, then I think that whole issue of staving off a Libya-like scenario will have been taken care of. So I feel that we're headed towards, since you asked me about where we're headed towards having a very strong government. I think what we need to ensure, and that's also to some of the very legitimate points that Wael raised, we need to ensure that we maintain a very strong civil society. One of the gentlemen here, who I think he said that he was based in Turkey earlier today, talked about power, sweet power. I couldn't agree more with you. And so I think that's why it's very important to maintain a very strong civil society, to have checks and balances. That task, I think, falls to us, falls to people in Syria. But to get there, yes, of course, that's the political life. Having political life is very important. But I think to get there, and I'm going to conclude on this point, to get there, we need to ensure that we're empowering the civilian population. Some people, unfortunately, some very misguided voices, wanted to demand these things through using sanctions as a leverage. Sanctions should not be lifted unless we have political parties and democracies in Switzerland in a couple of months. I was vehemently opposed to that, because towards the end of my first month in Syria, even though I had a lot of money in my pocket, even though my family is not poor, even though I knew I could go back to the United States anytime I wanted, towards the end of my stay, the last week, I started acting like a local. I was jostling, because you can't help but because of daily life, just going through daily life is really tough. And I was not staying at a hotel. If you're staying at a hotel, you have the lights on most of the day, and you have Wi-Fi. I was not staying at a hotel. I was staying at my family's home. And again, we're not poor, but simply, energy is scarce. So by going through daily life, and it's like you become less focused on Jeffersonian democracy, and you're like, I don't want to hear anything about that. Like, I wanted to ensure that I was getting to places in time, and let alone people who didn't have access to the resources that I had. So what I'm trying to say here, and this is also to the Muslim American community, we need to ensure that all restrictions, there are a lot of restrictions that are still in place, like the export controls. There will be more good news coming down the pipeline, inshallah, very soon. But there are still things in place. We need everything lifted. We need the SST designation lifted because we need to empower the population, because the population is the best bet for an inclusive future. Thank you.
Thank you. CSID for having me. Let me first start by saying I'm here in my personal capacity. Sadly, I had to leave the Atlantic Council just yesterday as the news came out. So very happy to be here with you ahead of my travels to Damascus. Ahead of my move.
Congratulations for leaving the Atlantic Council for greener pastures.
I mean, it's look. I mean. It's been great, like all of this time I've been spending in DC. It's a big move for me actually going back to Damascus, and this is, I think, part of the transformation that Syria is going through, and we are going through as Syrians as well. And this is actually what I wanted to highlight in my opening remarks, is that all of those different transformations that Syria and Syrians are going through. I think starting with Syria itself, we just left a 62 years old dictatorship from 1963. I grew up in a household where my own father was a scholar of nonviolence in Islam. He was detained 8 times between 1960s and 1980s. And I didn't know any of his history until he died, because he was too afraid for our own sake to tell us who he is, what he was doing in society. And this is the Syria, and I mean, again, like, if you ask people, my dad, they would tell you like he is the most courageous person they knew, but even the most courageous person at the time under Assad was not even able to tell his own kids who he was or what he does. So that is the Syria we grew up in. So it's a moment to really take in, and I think all of us, I'm still taking this in, trying to really understand this transformation that our country has been through on December 8th, but also this transformation that we've been part of as Syrians, at least for the last 14 years or even beyond, as young as I can remember back in the day. We're finally done with this chapter, and we are opening a new chapter. And as Ala and Wa'il mentioned, there are so many challenges ahead of us. The Assads basically left Syria with nothing. Not only in terms of, we always think of money in the central bank, assets here and there, but they actually even left no institutions, because in the last 14 years the Assads did not only fight the Syrian people themselves and killed them with chemical weapons, with barrel bombs, with Scud missiles, but they also destroyed even government institutions, because as they were trying to feed basically their own army, they turned the public sector into a way basically to benefit the families of soldiers, of intelligence officers. So literally by December 8th, there was nothing left. And as officers in the army, in the intelligence, and the police were escaping the capital in different places because they knew what they were doing, not because someone was threatening them, but they knew what they were up to in the last 14 years. It's not only them that they left. Their families, who basically were monopolizing the public sector, also left with them, which almost in a sense, basically, that moment on December 8th was a complete state collapse in so many different sectors. So in a sense, also as we realize the transformation, I think as a Syrian, I'm very proud also of how much Syrians were on autopilot to really preserve the country after December 8th. And even until today, I mean, when we talk about security level, yes, security in the country is pretty weak. As I say, the main security force is existence in the capital. The country, definitely after 14 years of war, is full of weapons. But what is really preventing the country from sliding into a bloody civil war, as we've seen in so many examples as political scientists, what is preserving that from happening is this autopilot that Syrians are on. They feel, and this is every Syrian you would meet today, they would tell you, we finally got our country back. And that, I mean, I'm feeling the goosebumps as I'm telling you that. That by itself, what a moment is that for, not only for Syria, but for the whole region. So that transformation that Syria, of course, like is going through is a moment I think is feeding this this hype, this positive feelings that all of Syrians are going through that make them, be patient on 4 hours of electricity a day, internet in many places that is still on 2G networks. For those of you who are old enough to actually remember 2G networks. And at the same time, yes, we do realize the challenges that are coming ahead. What I would say is, as we externally monitor what is happening, I think what is very important for Syria is to give Syria a chance. Those 62 years of a lot of people, when the transitional period was announced, everyone was saying, is this too long? Is this too short? This is a full presidential term. Do we need 5 years in Syria? As a political science, I can tell you, on average, with such civil wars, like Syria, in terms of length, in terms of intensity, the average actually transitional period is about 7 years. So we are very optimistic to actually plan for 5 years. But what I would also say, to Syrians, but also to people who are watching outside, and in a sense, I think part of those who are watching outside, some of us, we've seen so many different experiences that have failed. So I think we are very much afraid of, wishing for the best for Syria, and then things would go south and we would be disappointed. And there are many who actually wish for this experience to fail. And my message is always, as Syrians who've been patient for 62 years over this dictatorship of Assad, I'm willing to be patient for at least 5 to 10 years for this transformation to actually be successful. Because for those of us who work in the policy world, we do know that fixing things does not happen overnight. And that this work is really, for the long haul, is not really for a year or two. It's a generational change that requires to happen. But what is very important is that as Syrians, we are all in to make sure that this is successful. This is not only Qutayba speaking, this is so many Syrians who are willing to do the work, to take the plunge, to come back to a country that is completely destroyed, to continue the mission. And this is a reminder, I think, also to all of us who've been, in a sense, also focused on, or very much working on democracy in the Muslim world. This is the mission here. This is a continuation of the mission. And as I moved to Damascus, this is also the way I see it. I came to Washington in 2013 because I realized that there is more space in Washington for me to work on freedom and democracy in Syria than there was a space within the political elite circles of the opposition across the region. And in a sense, I see my return to Damascus today as a continuation of this mission, because that is where the work that needs to be done. So one very transformative moment for Syria. It will take time. I think what makes me optimistic that no matter how much time it will take, the minimum that is there, which it's part of the prophetic heritage. The Prophet ﷺ, his main message in Mecca for so many years was خَلُّوا بَيْنِي وَبَيْنَ النَّاسِ. Let me and the people be. Basically, give me freedom. And in Syria today, we do have that. You have the freedom to speak, you have the freedom to politically organize, you have the freedom to do the work that you need. And that by itself, preserving that is the most important element, because no society, no matter what happens on a higher level, whether there are so many pending questions, I think there will be elections, I think there will be some sort of political transition. There is a question how democratic Syria it would be, how would that fit within the region. Those are all pending questions, but I think preserving that minimum where there is freedom of expression and freedom of political work, the fact that we have that, I think it is on us as Syrians, as individuals, and how active we are to make sure this transforms to something else. So I feel we've won by the fact that we have that, because our fight with Assad was exactly about that. It was about going out and preaching and talking to people about politics, about religion, about the society, about everything else. That was the fight from 2011 until 2024. For me, that was the main fight. Just خلوا بيني وبين الناس, خلوا بيننا وبين الناس. I think the second transformation, which is very important, is a transformation for the region. Let's be very clear, for so many decades, Iran has been, first the Assad regime has been the bully of the region. They fought, Palestinians and Lebanese in Lebanon, starting 1978, killed both Palestinians and Lebanese there. They were a tool for Iran whenever Iran wanted to actually go over the region, destabilize the region. And I'm talking here about the whole region. I'm talking, even in the last, sometimes we have like narrow focus to really think about only Iranian-Israeli kind of like confrontation or fight over hegemony in the region. But this is not about that. Iran, for example, for starting 2019 until 2024, was utilizing Syria to infiltrate Jordan, to send weapons and drugs there because they wanted to destabilize Jordan. And from there, and that was the main problem with Iran, similar actually to Israel, is that there was no end goal that you can see. So you can never know, like, oh, is there anything after Syria? Is there anything after Jordan? So the fact that now Syria has kind of like cut off that Iranian access from the region, I think is a win for all of us. I'm not I don't believe that the Iranian project, in a sense, was about the transformation of the region, was about actually the freedom of the Muslim Ummah. I don't believe that was ever the case. I think it was a very political project that uses religion as a cover to try to infiltrate, different Muslim societies. But that transformation, I think, is very important because it really allows to bring back some balance between political Sunni and political Shia powers in the region. And hopefully it would allow to actually have a serious conversation, constructive conversation, about reducing the polarization between political Sunni and political Shia in the region. Because now there is some military balance, at least in a sense, or geopolitical balance that allows for that conversation to happen. In the last so many decades, the lack of geopolitical balance was really preventing that conversation from going anywhere. And my own father has worked a lot on this in the 1990s and early 2000s with President Khatami and others. And that conversation was not going anywhere because Iran had the access on the ground. They didn't really have to give up anything. So I think looking to see how would that also transform the region is very important. The third and most important one, which is always the elephant in the room, I think not a lot of people are talking about, we are talking about a new experience of conservative Sunni political power that is taking over in Syria. And that is presenting a new view for politics that we're not really used to. And in a sense, it has been really interesting the last 6 months. I think here in Washington, a lot of people are looking at the group, I would call it, because it's HTS++ right now. There is no name. They're looking at it from the lens of, Al-Qaeda in Iraq or, Al-Qaeda in 2011. And they're missing really all of the transformation that happened between 2013 and 2024. Some of us who also have not been following Syria, especially between 2016 and 2024, they're looking at it from the lens of 2016. But there was a lot of actually not only political transformation, there was a lot of ideological transformation that happened actually in Syria. And a revision of a Sunni view to how actually a conservative Sunni power could rule, a view of transnational jihadism, a view of the Salafi jihadism itself. It didn't start in 2016. It actually, interesting enough, it started in prisons that Assad set up for jihadists who fought in Iraq, and then that revision started in those prisons back in 2006 and 2007. But then on the ground, when there was no more practice, there was actually more revision and transformation to really, work practically in fixing those ideas or changing those ideas that were just merely theoretical for so many years. So we have this new model, which I think it has two important things. One, it's very realist and very operational. It doesn't talk about theory. It tries to implement Islamic fiqh in a way that really touches the lives of people. So in a sense, we need to look at this project and how it is really trying to think immediately, how can we make the lives of people better? And that is very important within Islamic theology of the state.
Can you expand on this point a little bit? Because, part of the challenge, this forum has been going on for 23 years. Conversations about Islamism, Islamic democracy have been happening for decades, even more than that. But this specific question of a new Sunni conservative model that you just brought up, and what it means in Syria, and what it means for transnational jihadism and transnational Islamism. If you could talk a little bit about this, because part of the challenge that you get to when you talk about Syria is people will say, well, President Ahmed Shara, he was in a prison in Iraq. How is he suddenly now meeting with Trump and Riyadh? How did that transformation happen? Is that real? Is this some conspiracy project that the Americans created? And now you're talking about the fact that there was this transformation, and the fact that he really has not talked about fiqh. He has not talked about an Islamic state. He has not talked about implementing Sharia, where you have places like Afghanistan, and you've got places like parts of North Africa, where the first conversation goes to implementation of Sharia and everything else. Talk a little bit about that.
So that is actually the second element that we need to talk about in this experience, which is it has peace with the modern state as a model to govern people, which in previous Islamic models, I feel in a sense, the latest model usually people go back to is Al-Khulafa al-Rashidin. So, I think, as people try to move forward, probably the latest model people can talk to, Islamic model, is the Ottomans. But there is a big gap that is left there, and that is always, there was always then a problem okay, how do you reconcile that with the modern state itself, and how much power the modern state and control over society? So I think to start with, there is a lot of peace under this project with the modern state. It looks at the state as a tool of a time, not by itself basically like a project of Islam itself. So in a sense, the impact you have again on society is the most important element, not the tool that you are using as part of this ruling. So that on one hand, and I think what is really important is that it looks really at a limited role of the state. It looks at the public space, not as a space for the government to control. So it's not really a super invasive modern state. It's actually a more kind of light modern state that sees that the role to control the public space is for the society, not for the state. So that kind of leaves the issue of Sharia and implementing Sharia. It is not really the job of the state. It is the job of the society to decide how it wants to rule itself. And that kind of brings a high level of decentralization, if you want to call it federalism in a sense, because then each society, can decide the parameters. There are general parameters the state sets.
Islamic federalism.
Yes, yeah.
Islamic civic federalism almost.
Yeah. No, I agree with what you're talking about, but it's not, don't think of it in the geographic way. Okay.
Yeah.
Because federalism and decentralization is usually tied to a piece of land. And this is about distinguishing between the personal societal space and the political government role. And in that sense, it is a unique model that even, in a way, it's a separation of state and church and state. Obviously, it has its own flavor. But on that, in a way, it's also, it's another variation of what the Saudis are doing in Saudi Arabia, to some degree, right? Again, there are major differences here. One is a monarchy, it's been there for hundreds of years, versus a rebel movement that essentially seized power in Damascus, and that is very popular. That's kind of where some of the region is heading, is how do we improve the economic situations, how do we create jobs, how do we end the wars, how do we end the instabilities, at least the political security ones. Yes. But we will manage the economy, the politics, and the diplomacy, and make the major macro decisions. And obviously, again, there's differences in all of that. So that's the piece I was alluding to earlier. And so the question is not about the personal freedoms, it is about the political decisions of the country. I agree with Talib completely. And that's why a lot of the non-Muslim communities in Syria are feeling better, including the Christian community, is that they're coming to terms that our personal religious sectarian needs, we might be able to manage them with even greater freedom than the previous regime, with lesser interference by the state.
To end there, so that is why I think it's important to keep an eye on that model and how it evolves, because in a sense we might be seeing kind of like the best model that reconciles the situation, the political situation of the region, the cultural and religious background, but also reconciles with previous experiences. And I think if we look at that transformation that's happened between, let's say, at least 2011 and 2024, there are so many lessons to learn off, but also it carries a lot of hope, because there is, in a sense, there was no problem of admitting where the project really failed, and there was no problem, in a sense, of shifting gears and moving to sometimes a completely different way of implementing governance when they figure out that, yes, this does not work. It works with certain society, but as you expand, because the project was expanding also in terms of geography, in terms of the type of societies they were ruling. So I'm also optimistic about this transformation and what it would mean for the whole relationship between Islam and democracy in the region and across the globe.
And that's what, one of the things that kind of excites me about this is we've been dealing, as students in the region, we've been dealing with transnational jihadists and Islamists. There was never a model that actually stuck that could help in that evolution and transformation of thought and practice. And now maybe there is a potential model of success, and that can change the dynamic between the state, democracy, and Islam. And I think there's a lot there. We'll open it up to the audience. I do want to say, 14 years ago, in Washington, D.C., I think when everybody was debating the Syria thing after the revolution started, MPAC, we hosted, I think it was the first conference.
I remember.
Do you remember that? On the revolution. Yes. With the New American Foundation.
Yes.
With MPAC and the New American Foundation. Yes. So I do want to mention that.
That's why I said we're also grateful we had Alex.
But we'll go ahead and open it up. We've got a few minutes. We'll start from there and then head this way. Kareem, please go ahead.
Thank you.
We can hear you. We can hear you. Go for it.
Yeah.
No, but we have 50 people on Zoom.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Thank you for the panel. Thank you for hosting this this conversation. As a Syrian American, my name is Kareem. I'm a private citizen. Obviously, I was born in Damascus, so I have strong interest in the information you shared. One question I had that I don't think was directly addressed is the continued, at least inside Washington, D.C., the continued securitization of Syria. I understand that the primary focus of the interim government is economic in nature. Fully understood. The message is very clear. But the primary conversation in officialdom in Washington, D.C. is still a securitized Syria, for good reason, perhaps. I think, Ala, you mentioned something about the efforts that are being undertaken to unite the security apparatus and the military apparatus outside of the Assad regime, mukhabarat, that we're all familiar with. What are the solid steps, if you know of those steps, to tackle the securitization of Syria, the continuous securitization of Syria, whether within the U.S. government or more broadly in society here in D.C.? Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be largely the responsibility of the Syrian government. Is to address that in the sense that if there are legitimate security concerns, that they address them, right? Whether it is regarding, you hear about the presence of foreign fighters and sensitive folks in the Syrian government. That's one. The disposition of ISIS fighters and their families who are still in Syria by the thousands in a few camps. Al-Hur is one of them. That's going to be transferred to the Syrian government from the SDF. Assurances to regional countries. Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq has concerns. Israel, they will have their unique sensitivities. So addressing that directly with them or through intermediaries that, look, I may not be able to have a full peace treaty with you, but leave me alone and I'll leave you alone. Or in other cases, how do we build bilateral relationships and healthy economic trade and investments and all of that. But also it is their representation here should be pushing on other avenues to reorient the focus as well, to change the conversation, to change the narrative, right? So be on the offensive regarding the investment, business opportunities in Syria. Tourism, cultural exchanges. Syria has a rich, very rich and lovely culture. Food, music, right? All art. And so it is addressing the legitimate issues or dispelling any rumors or disinformation or addressing things that are real, but also provide other discussion topics with policymakers here away from only the challenges, but also the opportunities. And for that, I think that's a conversation a lot of people want to have. I mean, I was in the Bay Area talking to some tech executives about what's happening in Syria and the region, and of course, President Trump went out there and went to those countries and took a lot of executives with him. They don't know the region. They don't know what's happening in Syria. They only know as much as the average person. And so, but then once you start talking about the opportunities there that are mutually beneficial for the development of Syria, and yes, a return on investment for the investor. That's what business is. You see a lot of folks interested, and there is actually still despite the 14 years of war, Syria has positive connotation, actually, when you just get beyond the Civil War period in terms of its food, its culture, how lovely its people are, its geographic location. There's nostalgia there. There's maybe a romanticization of it, which could be good if it's leveraged properly for the benefits of the people and for strengthening bilateral relationships, away from just the, quite frankly, generally speaking, the Orientalist view of looking at the region and its people either as victims, poor immigrants who are drowning in the Mediterranean, or as terrorists.
Yeah. And if I also may add to that, so...
Can I ask the panelists to keep the answers short, because there are a lot of questions.
Sure.
If you could add, since you're not a government official yet, either in Syria or Washington, Damascus or Washington, can you add to the security conversation quickly? Israel is the big elephant in the room. And I don't think many people...
So I was going to talk about that, actually. I was going to talk about that, but briefly.
How is Israel going to allow a viable, democratic state that has a military and is capable of defending itself and its borders, how will Israel allow that honest work?
Yeah, so I think that requires a whole panel, but let me do my best. Karim, I couldn't agree more with you, and I think you know best that this issue of looking at the whole region through the lens of CT, or counterterrorism, is not unique to Syria. It is an issue that has bedeviled me personally. I move in policy circles. We have a lot of conversations with lawmakers and government officials, and this has been a constant refrain in every single conversation. Like, you want to address lawmakers and talk to them about, the Syrian as a human being, etc. And the focus is always on CT. But again, that's not unique to Syria. That's sadly, in the past, U.S. policy towards the Middle East was energy and CT, and as thanks to fracking, energy took a backseat, and now it's mostly CT. That's number one. Number two, and that's to your point, Haris. We have a very powerful neighbor to the south, and they have a lot of clout and influence in Washington, D.C. Okay, so that aspect of the conversation, the security aspect, will always be there. Now, do to the extent that we have control over this, I think what we can do both here as a community, like the Syrian American community, but also folks on the ground in Damascus, is to try always to widen the aperture, to talk about the opportunities that Syria offers. And I think we have an excellent ally in Ambassador Tom Barrack, who is the U.S. Special Envoy to Syria, because that's all he talks about. He talks about business and investment and opportunities and self-determination. So I think the needle is moving on that, but while I'm cautiously optimistic, I'm also cognizant, just because I'm a realist too, that this is going to stay with us. Now, what I can say on a panel like this, very maybe cryptically, is that the past 6 months have been incredibly tough, specifically because of this, because this neighbor to the south was not too enthusiastic, and so the first week after the fall of the Assad regime, they conducted, I think, about 400 airstrikes, took out the whole navy, took out tanks and missiles and rockets, like pretty much the entire Syrian military. And then since then, it's been about 700 attacks. So 400 just the first week. Okay, I remember that was the first site that welcomed me to Damascus. The huge bombing up until the bombing continued until 3 a.m. I wasn't able to sleep because I was not used to it. People around me, slept like there was no problem. I wasn't able to because I wasn't used to it. And so I think it's public information. Reuters and other news agencies, the Netanyahu government didn't want sanctions to be lifted, does not want the United States to withdraw from Syria. They are deeply skeptical about the new government. I think President Trump took a decision despite those apprehensions, and a lot of lawmakers are just gonna, I think, go with the president. Now, if I recently did a tour of conservative circles in Washington, D.C., like we're talking like very far-right organizations, as well as very conservative lawmakers. We did that for a couple of days. And even though President Trump has made that decision, the skepticism is still there, and it's deep. And I think maybe as Syria proves that we are headed there. The president said we have no plans to pose a threat to any of our neighbors. They shut down the Captagon trade. That was a scourge and a blight in the region, especially for Saudi Arabia and Jordan and other countries. I think you're going to see more of those Syrian aspects being highlighted. But big picture, I think CT is going to stay with us.
Very quickly, just on the security question, when President Sharar talks about the economy, it's not a change of topic. The argument from the Syrian government is, yes, absolutely, security matters. DDR, I know we love this word, it was never implemented right anywhere else. But for such a process to be in place, you need to improve the economy. It was at the beginning, in the first few months, it's a chicken and egg question. I think some in the Trump administration were saying, no, you need to do that first. You need to have control over all of Syria, control all of the security, and then sanctions would be lifted. And I think where the argument settled at the end is that that does not make any sense. If you want an effective state that actually controls the use of violence, controls who holds arms, you need to have the resources to do that. And if you want, and this is, I think, where the conversation, I guess, gets tricky. Yes, there are people who don't want this project to be successful. There are people in Washington who once said, all of the Arab Springs brought, the old regimes back. Why don't we try to bring back Assad? And they definitely don't want things to move forward. But I think what has been missing here is that the main security challenges that we've seen in the last 6 months, they're not sectarian in nature as they've been portrayed in Washington. They are political in nature. You have former regime or current regime supporters among the Alawite communities who did the first insurgency in the coast. You have current regime supporters within the Druze community who are still holding power in Jerman and Sweden. And that is the main challenge. So I think where the current leadership in Washington, where their mind is that, yes, we need to tackle those challenges in Syria because those are Assadists, those are pro-Iran supporters, and we need to have the resources in place to be able to tackle those challenges, and that's where the sanction lifting actually came.
Right here. Paulsha, please go ahead. And if you can keep your questions brief and then please.
Maybe direct them to us specifically.
Yes.
So we're not all,
Yeah, we can get a couple of questions. So if you
Sure.
go ahead, Paulsha.
Yeah, my question, actually, you had mentioned a little bit about the deal, a possible deal with the SDF in the north, and we've heard that they have a very unique way of doing governance that's very inclusive of religious minorities, and that, whether that's going to be in clash or how that actually might play out. I was wondering if you could speak to some of those issues.
And then we'll take a question to your yes. And then we can answer to
Hi, this is for whoever wants to answer it. One of my concerns is that Syria has changed hands from Russian-controlled domination to contested control and domination, primarily from the United States and potential Emirati and Saudi investors. The word democracy and democratic elections is not really on the table. We have a self-appointed president, and certainly this is better than war, and turning Syria into a bigger UAE-style country is better than war. But can we really talk about Syrian liberation without democracy? And I also wonder, in terms of the lifting of sanctions, what Syria had to give up in terms of concessions to the United States. There's been very little written about it, but I expect with our transactional president that Syria had to give up a nice slice of Syria's assets, just as Ukraine has, for continued U.S. support.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and answer those two.
Just a point. Maybe just a point about democracy. So democracy should continue. Democracy should 100%. I'm a pro-democracy activist, and that's why I spent the past 14, 15 years of my life fighting for this. So I'm in 100% alignment with you, and this should continue to be the aspiration and the goal. Now, having said that, I'll also share with you that I think it was 2 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, I hosted the former Tunisian president for an event at my place, and I'll never forget what he shared with me, President Moussaf Marzouki. He said, and we share a lot of similarities because, I'm an activist. Of course, he's a much more high-profile, activist, but we come from the same background: activists, human rights activists, same. And so we're preoccupied with the same things. And I'll never forget what he told me. He was like, "We spent the first 3 years nitpicking about this word and that word and this phrase and that phrase in the Constitution, and look what happened to Tunisia now." Because eventually people got fed up and they felt that transition did not deliver on the promise. In their mind, democracy, I think, meant, economic transformation. So again, back to the daily realities. if you were to spend, and I would encourage you maybe to go and visit, and don't stay at a hotel, maybe stay with a friend, experience life in Syria at the moment. If you've been there for a month, you will not want to talk about the same things that you just talked about now. You will want to ensure that your belly is full. So I think this is where we are now. And as far as that is concerned, I think the government has its priority raised. Now, once we've maybe successfully navigated this transitional period, I completely agree with you. I'm not trying to beat around the bush. It is a challenge. I am for separation of powers. I am for consultative decision making and so forth. And we need to have that because I think that's a root of all evil. But for us to, I think, be too focused on that at a time when people can't. I overheard arguments, heated arguments between older ladies and minibus drivers because they could not afford 5 cents to take the bus, and they were complaining that the fare had been doubled from, I think, 2 or 3 cents to 5 cents. This is where we are. We're not at a stage where we can discuss restoring democracy, but yes, I completely agree with you. It should continue to be that.
First question about SDF.
Yeah, go ahead. Just what you need, not something.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, I think on both.
What was in exchange?
Concessions. So very quickly, I think one on democracy and on the SDF question. I think as Syrians, it's really about the frameworks that exist. It's not really about the banners. I was in Syria in 2011. Democracy as a word was not really on the agenda and our banners and our, yes, I mean, it sounds great, but because I've heard this a lot, why did the constitutional declaration did not include the word democracy? Well, I mean, I was there in 2011. For me, the word democracy itself is not my battle. It's not the hill I want to die on. The hill I want to die on is whether there is freedom of expression, freedom of political organization, and then, yes, there is a political process in place where there is election. Whether that is called democracy or not, to be honest, as a Syrian, I don't really care, like how we call it as Syrian, because we have our own experience, and we do have the right to call our experience the way we like it. We're not bound by specific liberal Western democracy terms. We love the experience. We want to copy that and make sure it is like we have a representative democracy, but it might have a different name. So just like on the title, I think on the experience itself, and that actually goes to the Northeast Project and the Autonomous Administration Project. The Autonomous Administration Project has a lot of those. It has the nice titles. It has in every single position a president, like a co-presidents, a man and a woman. It looks great, but from the inside, it's really rowdy. Because in every single institution you have a man and a woman leading the institution, but there is someone called a cadre, basically someone who's a member of the Marxist, Communist, PKK, who actually controls the institution. So in a sense, yes, it is great to have a man and woman place. It's great that you call it, a democratic institution. But at the end of the day, it is not democratic, and it is controlled by one single party like the Ba'ath regime. So do we want to copy that experience to the rest of Syria? I don't think Syrians want that experience to be copied. Do we want that local communities with specific cultural and religious heritage to see that cultural and religious heritage reflected in their own communities? Absolutely, yes. I mean, I can tell you, even like as a Kurd myself, yes, that is very important, because that is what, at the end of the day, matters for average Syrians, whether Kurds, Assyrians, Druze, or otherwise. It's not what the capital looks like. You see your culture and your heritage and your religion in the schools you send your kids to, in the street that you live in, and that's what really matters at the end of the day. And that is the model, I guess, we see some infrastructure put forth for it. The conversation right now between Damascus and Qamishli, actually very much there's an agreement on that part. The problem is that we have with the SDF is that the SDF controls 3 provinces of Hasakeh, Raqqa, and Deir ez-Zor. The vast majority of those provinces are Arabs. They are not Kurds. And basically, the SDF is saying, we currently control that, good luck. It's like, it's not really about the Kurdish project, because the government has already said, go back to Kurdish regions, and all of those cultural and, and religious and heritage rights, you will have it there for your own communities as any other Syrian community. But the SDF wants to, right now, to maintain control over Arab majority or almost 100% Arab communities, especially in Raqqa and Deir Zor. So that's where the conversation is. I think if that is resolved, and I can tell you, I think the mistake that the PYD is doing as a political party, is that it is jeopardizing the Kurdish experience in Syria. There is a very possible and good win for the Kurdish community in Syria, especially the ones who came in the early 1900s. They still speak Kurdish. They live in northeast Syria. They're a minority within the Kurdish community, but they've been taking the lead on this conversation. And they can actually make something for the Kurdish community, but I think wanting a lot more than what is possible might jeopardize that. Last but not least, on just the concessions, so far there has been, and that is something, I can tell you, the Syrian government could tell you the exact same thing, US officials have said the exact same thing. There were no conditions when it came to sanctions lifting. There are mutual security concerns that will be addressed. It's not something that the Syrian government does not want to address. Whatever you hear in media, it is something that is of concern for the Syrian government. But President Trump and Secretary Rubio, Ambassador Barak made it very clear that if Syria does not succeed, that is the problem. That is what everyone is trying to prevent. Not only the United States, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, everyone in the region, they see the alternative. And the alternative is very bad for the region, for the United States. The second thing, which is very important, yes, there is an opportunity for Syria. And I think whether it is President Trump or others in the administration, they do see the economic opportunity that maybe it doesn't exist. It exists in Ukraine, possibly if there is a deal, but it doesn't exist as much in Syria. You have at least a $1 trillion of possible infrastructure projects that could be done in Syria. The EU has already committed just for this year $7 billion for infrastructure projects in Syria. The Gulf has not even set basically a budget for that. So is there an economic opportunity where actually, from US perspective, US companies can come in and invest? Yeah, absolutely. And for that, it does make sense then to lift sanctions. If we see something down the line, it's important to point out, but as a watcher, let's say, there has been, this whole conversation is about the opportunity that Syria can present for the US and for the region.
Thank you so much. I know there's a lot of questions.
And we have only 2 minutes left.
We have 2 minutes left, so we'll go here, but then our panelists will be around and you can have a conversation. And I think we need to do a day-long Syria conversation.
I need more Syria.
Yeah. So I think we need to maybe our organizations work together on doing a day-long thing, because I think there's a lot of implications. We'll go here and take 2 questions, and then we'll end it. Go ahead, please. You can stand up and ask a question, and I'll repeat it if need be.
I think for the recording device. Yeah, time is up, but I have 2 quick questions.
Let's take one, and
I don't know which one I prefer. So, since we are talking in the panel at the head of defending democracy in Muslim world, I think Iranian influence was terrible in Syria, but Turkey's as a model should not be negative as well. Because yes, Syria had the Sednaya, but now Erdogan has Silivri. The Istanbul mayor now in jail, who was the main rival to him. So this ideology, the political Islamist ideology, I am very much happy that Syrians got the freedom, but I as a person experienced this, I like to warn that you need to be careful, and if there are some control mechanisms to prevent sliding back into an Islamic-oriented authoritarianism, which will be terrible. I don't know what one of you can take. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And then we'll take your question, and then we'll wrap up the session.
Just very quickly, Sanjeev Barrett, Freedom Forward. There was a moment when people in the West didn't have a story to tell about the Syrian refugee crisis, and then there were actors with malintent who told a story that was very harmful. And it seems like we're in the former moment now, a good moment, where there's an opportunity to build political power and goodwill beyond policymakers, beyond the Syrian diaspora, beyond even Muslim American communities. Amidst everything else that you're dealing with, all of the challenges, has there been thought given to that kind of a political program?
I didn't understand.
Yes, can you, yeah.
Just briefly, maybe just to repeat, a lot of people in the West, outside of diaspora circles, outside of American Muslim circles, don't have a story yet about the new Syria and the future of Syria. Someone's going to tell that story, right? Vacuums don't exist for long in politics. Is there a strategy, or has there been thought given to how to fill that vacuum in a positive way to empower you to do what you need to do?
Yeah. So obviously, you know, a lot of, I think, civil society organizations here, you know, Syrian American community organizations or others, that's what they work on. And also the Syrian government, again, now there's a government in Syria, they have agency, they have plans. So I don't know, maybe Qutayba can shed any lights on that. But, you know, for example, I'm also advising a group called the Syrian Forum on promoting investment and reconstruction in Syria. And that's the job of such organizations, go out there and tell that story. I'm really interested to see what will happen in the cultural space. Because again, Syria has an advantage there in terms of its rich history, culture. You know, just the ruins in Syria are spectacular, and they are essentially part of the cradle of civilizations where alphabet was invented. So on that, I think you're going to see that. Particularly the Syrian American community is extremely creative and hardworking, and you know, they've had some wins right now, and they want to keep winning in the form of normalizing the relationships between the U.S. and Syria and seeing Syria reach its full potential. On the other piece regarding, gentlemen, sounds like you're Turkish, and so that's a question for Syria. I mean, just to be very fair-minded about it. Syria couldn't recover without lifting the sanction or grow. But as you do that, you are empowering the current government to become more effective, more powerful, right? More popular, stronger. Is this government going to be representative of most Syrians and their aspirations or not? That's the question. And can they do that with the current formulations? You know, they came to power. Now we have 4 or 5 years for the elections. What lies beyond that? Will they be able to include groups or individuals who didn't liberate Syria with them? Right? There's a group identity here also. We get hung up on Islamist or not Islamist, but it's a group identity. It's a group that fought and weathered a lot of tribulation in a corner of Syria. They know each other. They trust each other. They know who their friends were during the difficult years. And then they rode down to Damascus and won. And will they be able to be inclusive or transition that power eventually to another group? I think the Syrian people, what they're clear about is, yes, they want economic recovery and stability now. But also the Syrian people did not fight and die against a dictator to replace it with another. I think they know, and I think the Syrian government knows this. And so my hope is that they will navigate that through transparent, fair, and humane processes. And I agree with Qutayba, what we call it is going to be less important, but it needs to look and feel and smell like democracy.
Thank you so much. A round of applause for our panelists for this great discussion. When it comes to the culture part, someone's going to write President Shara's story in Hollywood. You guys better get on that, because someone's definitely going to write that story. But thank you so much, and we hope to continue this conversation, and I'll pass it back over to the board.